The sky had turned the color of old iron when Margaret felt the first true bite of winter's cruelty. It wasn't just the cold, it was the deliberate, calculated coldness in her brother-in-law's eyes as he stood in the doorway of the only home her 7 children had ever known. His arms crossed over his chest like a judge pronouncing sentence. "You've got until sundown," Howard said, his breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. "After that, I'm boarding up the window. This land doesn't feed dead men's families." It was March of 1954, and the Alaskan interior was still locked in winter's grip. 8 months had passed since the mine collapse had taken Thomas, buried him under tons of rock and ice where they'd never even recovered his body. 8 months of Margaret stretching every penny, every scrap of food, every hour of daylight, trying to keep 7 children alive on a widow's nothing. And now Howard, Thomas's older brother, had decided that charity had run its course. Margaret stood on the sagging porch of the timber cabin, her arms wrapped around Samuel, the 2-year-old who still asked for his daddy every morning. Behind her, through the open door, she could see her other 6 children watching with the unblinking eyes of those who'd learned too young that the world was not a kind place. Rose, the eldest at 14, held the baby while the middle children, Jacob, Peter, Anna, Mary, and little Lucy, huddled together like frightened birds. "Howard, please," Margaret heard herself say, hating the desperation in her voice. "Just until spring. The children aren't my problem." Howard's voice was flat, final. "Thomas took out a loan against this property before he died. Didn't tell you, did he? Probably ashamed. The bank's calling it in and I've got my own family to feed. You think I'm made of money? You think I can support 8 extra mouths through another Alaskan winter?" Margaret felt the words like physical blows. Thomas had borrowed against the cabin. He'd never said anything. But then, Thomas had been proud, stubborn, convinced the mine would provide, that one more season would be the one that changed everything. And instead, the mine had killed him, and the debt had survived him. "Where are we supposed to go?" The question came out as barely a whisper. Howard shrugged, already turning away. "There's the church in town. Maybe they'll take you in. Maybe you can find work. But you can't stay here. I've already promised the property to the mining company. They're using it for storage come April." He walked back inside what had been Margaret's home, began gathering her few possessions, a cast iron pot, 2 threadbare blankets, the clothes they wore, and deposited them unceremoniously in the snow outside. The children's few toys, hand-carved by Thomas during long winter nights, landed in a pile that looked more like refuse than anyone's life. Margaret stood in the snow, watching her existence being ejected from the cabin like something diseased. The children filed out one by one, their breath fogging in the bitter air, their thin coats, hand-me-downs, and patchwork repairs offering little protection against the 20 below temperature. By the time Howard slammed the door shut and dropped the crossbar into place, the sun was already sinking toward the jagged horizon of mountain to the west. In Alaska in March, that gave them maybe 2 hours of usable light, 2 hours to find shelter before the true cold came, the kind of cold that could kill an adult in an hour and a child in half that time. Margaret looked at her children, at their pinched faces and hollow eyes, at the way they shivered despite standing close together. Then she looked at the mountains, at the endless white expanse that surrounded the small mining settlement, at the forest of black spruce and white birch that marked the boundary between human habitation and the wilderness that had been here long before people came and would remain long after they were gone. She'd heard the stories, of course. Everyone in the settlement had, about the plane. It had crashed somewhere up in the higher elevations maybe 15 years ago, back during the war when military cargo planes had been flying supplies between bases. The wreckage had never been recovered. Too remote, too difficult to reach, too expensive to bother with once they'd confirmed there were no survivors. Over the years, it had become a local legend, a cautionary tale parents used to keep children from wandering too far into the wilderness. They called it the ghost plane, said it was cursed, said that strange lights could be seen up there on clear nights, that unearthly sounds carried down the mountain when the wind was right, screams and moans that couldn't possibly be just metal and weather, said that something had claimed the wreckage as its territory, something massive and territorial that had driven away every hunter or trapper who tried to investigate. Old Henrik, the Norwegian trapper who'd been in Alaska since before statehood, swore he'd seen the creature once. Big as a truck, he'd said, his roomy eyes distant with memory and fear. Grizzly, but not like any grizzly you ever saw. Old, ancient, mean as hell, and smart enough to know when it's being hunted. It lives up there by that plane, makes its den somewhere in the wreckage. I saw tracks in the snow bigger than dinner plates. Saw where it had torn apart a full-grown moose like it was made of paper. The other men had laughed nervously, the way men do when they're not entirely sure something is a joke. But they'd all agreed on one thing. No one went near the ghost plane. It was a place of death, marked by tragedy and claimed by nature's most perfect killing machine. Margaret looked at that mountain now, at the dark shape of the aircraft that was just barely visible if you knew where to look. A glint of metal against snow, an unnatural geometric shape among organic curves. It was perhaps 5 miles away as the crow flies. But in this terrain, with children and snow, it would be a nightmarish journey that could take hours. But what choice did she have? The settlement's church was 3 miles in the other direction, and Father Morrison, while kind, had made it clear the last time she'd asked for help that the church's resources were stretched thin. thin. We can offer prayers, Margaret, but we can't house 8 people through winter. The mining company's bunkhouses wouldn't take women and children. The other families in the settlement were barely surviving themselves, with no room or resources for charity. It was the plain or the open wilderness, and the wilderness was a death sentence. Mom, Rose's voice was small, frightened. What are we going to do? Margaret pulled her daughter close, feeling the fragile bones under the thin coat, made her decision. We're going to walk to the old plane, the one they say is up in the mountain. Rose's eyes went wide. The ghost plane? Mom, that's crazy. The stories are just stories. Margaret tried to sound confident, even as her own heart hammered with fear. It's shelter, Rose. Solid metal shelter. We can make a fire inside, stay warm until we figure something else out. It's our only chance. But the bears hibernate in winter, Margaret lied. She knew grizzlies could and did wake during winter, especially if disturbed. But she also knew her children needed hope more than truth right now. It'll be empty, I promise. She distributed what little they had among the older children. Jacob, at 10, carried the pot. Peter, 8, managed one of the blankets. Anna and Mary, 6 and 5, each held the hands of smaller siblings. Rose carried the baby, wrapped in the second blanket. And Margaret took Samuel, plus the small bundle of dried meat and crackers that represented their last food. They set out as the sun touched the mountain, turning the snow gold and then orange, and then the deep blue of impending darkness. Margaret didn't look back at the cabin, at the life she'd lost. There was only forward now, only the next step and the next. The first mile was relatively easy, a packed trail that hunters use, but then the trail ended and they were breaking through 2 feet of powder, then 3 feet in the drift. The children struggled, falling, getting back up, falling again. Margaret's legs burned with effort, her lungs seared by the frigid air. They'd been walking for an hour when Jacob spotted the tracks. They were enormous, paw prints in the snow that dwarfed Margaret's hand when she knelt to measure them. 4 parallel gouges marked where claws had dug in. The tracks were fresh, maybe hours old, and they led in the same direction they were heading, toward the plane. Mom, Jacob's voice shook. That's not from a regular bear. Margaret stared at the tracks, feeling her blood run cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. Henrik had been right. Whatever made these tracks was massive, powerful, and recently active in this area. She thought about turning back, but turning back meant what? Sleeping in the snow? Begging at doors that had already closed? Her children would die either way, quick from the cold or slow from starvation and exposure. Keep moving, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Stay close together. Make noise as we walk. Animals don't like surprise. They pushed on, climbing now as the terrain grew steeper. The mountains rose around them, black rock and white snow. The temperature was dropping fast, probably 30 below now, maybe more. Samuel had stopped crying, which terrified Margaret more than his tears had. That was the first stage of hypothermia, the dangerous quiet. The sun was gone, replaced by the deep purple blue of Arctic twilight. In another hour, they'd be in full darkness, and even if they wanted to turn back, they wouldn't be able to find their way. They were committed now, for better or worse. There! Rose's shout cut through the wind. I see it! The plane emerged from the gloom like a metal ghost. It was larger than Margaret had imagined, a massive cargo hauler that had broken into 2 main pieces on impact. The tail section pointed skyward at an impossible angle, while the main fuselage lay on its belly, partially buried in snow and ice that had accumulated over 15 years. Metal that had once been riveted smooth was now torn and twisted, creating cavities and openings where the elements had worked their patient destruction. But it was shelter, real, solid shelter. And despite every story, despite every warning, Margaret felt a surge of hope. They stumbled the last 100 yards, Margaret's legs nearly giving out from exhaustion and relief. As they got closer, she could see that the main cargo door had been partially torn off, creating an entrance just large enough for a person to squeeze through. She also saw the tracks, dozens of them, circling the plane, leading to and from a den-like hollow under the fuselage where the landing gear had once been. Something massive had been living here and leaving regularly to hunt, but it wasn't here now. That hollow was empty, just a dark cavity in the snow. Quickly, Margaret urged. Inside, all of before it comes back. They squeezed through the opening one by one into the dark interior of the cargo bay. The floor was tilted at an awkward angle, covered in ice frost, but it was out of the wind, and the metal, though cold, retained some small insulation value. Margaret gathered the children in the least damaged corner, wrapped them in the blankets, and held them as they shivered. Outside, the Arctic night descended fully, bringing with it a cold so intense it made the metal groan and crack. And then, cutting through the wind and darkness, they heard it for the first time. A scream. Not human, not animal, but something else. High and keening, like metal scraping metal, like a voice calling from a great distance. It seemed to come from the front of the plane, from the cockpit area, rising and falling with the wind. The children whimpered and pressed closer to Margaret. Even she felt her skin crawl at the sound. It was the scream that had given the plane its reputation, the ghost voice that had kept people away for 15 years. But Margaret, exhausted beyond fear, cold beyond caring, simply held her children tighter and whispered, "It's just the wind through broken metal. That's all it is." She didn't know if she believed it. She didn't know if they'd survive the night. She didn't know what would happen when that massive creature returned to find a den occupied. But for now, they were out of the snow. They were together. They were alive. And sometimes in the middle of an Alaskan winter, that was all you could ask for. Margaret closed her eyes against the darkness and the screaming wind and prayed for dawn. Outside in the snow, the massive tracks circled closer. The darkness inside the plane was absolute, a living thing that pressed against Margaret's eyes with physical weight. She could hear her children breathing, quick, shallow gasps that spoke of fear and cold working in tandem to shut down their small bodies. Samuel had gone limp in her arm, his silence more terrifying than any crying could be. She pressed her chapped lips to his forehead and felt the dangerous coolness there. Hypothermia was setting in, and they had no fire, no real warmth, nothing but each other and two threadbare blankets that were already stiff with frost. "Rose," Margaret whispered into the darkness, her voice hoarse from the cold air she'd been breathing for hours. "I need you to help me. We need to get everyone moving. We need to generate heat." She heard shuffling in the darkness, felt Rose's thin hand find hers. "How, Mom? We're so tired. The little ones can barely move." "I know, baby, I know. But if we sleep now, we might not wake up. We need to rub our hands together, move our legs, anything, keep the blood flowing. Can you help me with the others?" For the next hour, though time had become impossible to measure in the pitch blackness, Margaret and Rose worked their way through the huddled children, forcing them to move limbs that wanted nothing more than to stay still, to surrender to the dangerous sleep that hypothermia prompted. Margaret rubbed Samuel's arms and leg vigorously, breathing warm air onto his tiny fingers, refusing to let him slip away into that cold darkness. Gradually, painfully, the children began to respond. Small movements at first, then more sustained activity. Margaret made them sing quiet songs that Thomas used to hum while working, songs that reminded them of warmth and home and a father who would never sing again. As her eyes adjusted to the absolute darkness, Margaret began to notice something. Not light exactly, but the absence of complete blackness. Somewhere ahead, deeper in the fuselage, there seemed to be a slightly lighter quality to the air, as if moonlight or starlight was finding its way through some crack or opening. "Stay here," she told Rose. "Keep them moving. I'm going to explore." "Mom, no!" Rose's protest was immediate, fearful. "I have to, honey. We need to know what we're dealing with. We need to know if there's a better place to shelter or if there's anything here we can use. I'll be right back." Before Rose could protest further, Margaret moved forward into the dark, her hands outstretched, feeling her way along the frozen metal wall of the fuselage. The floor tilted beneath her feet. The plane had broken its back on impact, creating an uneven landscape of twisted metal and ice. She moved slowly, testing each step, conscious of jagged edges that could slice through her thin boots and flesh with equal ease. The cargo bay was larger than she'd realized, extending perhaps 40 feet back from where they had entered. As she moved forward, she began to make out shapes in the gloom, cargo crates that had broken open on impact, their contents scattered and frozen. She saw what looked like military supplies, boxes marked with faded stencils, metal drums, canvas tarps stiff with 15 years of ice, and then she saw the body. They were in the cockpit area, visible through a torn section of bulkhead. Two figures, still strapped into their seats, frozen in the positions they died in 15 years ago. The pilot and co-pilot, preserved by the Arctic cold, their faces turned toward each other as if they'd been talking when death came. Margaret felt her stomach lurch, but she forced herself to look, to bear witness to these men who died alone in this metal coffin. One of them, she couldn't tell which, still had a hand on what looked like a journal or logbook, as if he'd been trying to write something even as he froze to death. The book was trapped under ice now, fused to the metal dashboard by years of accumulated frost. It was the cockpit opening that was letting in the faint light. The windscreen had shattered partially, and though ice had sealed most of the gaps, small cracks allowed threads of moonlight and starlight to filter through. And it was through these cracks that the wind howled, creating that unearthly screaming sound that had terrified her children. Margaret understood now. The wind, moving at high speed through these specific cracks and gaps, was being funneled and compressed in ways that created that haunting, almost human-like wail. It wasn't a ghost, it was physics, acoustics, the voice of wind being tortured through broken metal. But understanding didn't make it less unsettled. She returned to the children, moving more quickly now that she knew the layout. "There's more space," she told them, "and there are supplies, old military supplies. We might find something useful once we have light. For now, we need to stay together and stay warm." As if in response to her words, the screaming intensified. The wind outside had picked up, and with it came a new sound, a deep rhythmic groaning that made the entire plane shudder. Margaret felt her heart skip. That wasn't the wind. That was something moving outside, something large enough to make the metal structure shake. The children heard it too. They pressed against Margaret, their fear palpable in the darkness. Samuel whimpered, finally making a sound, and while Margaret was grateful for any sign of life from him, she also knew that noise was dangerous. If something was out there, sound would draw it to them. "Shh," she breathed, covering Samuel's mouth gently with her hand. "Everyone be very, very quiet." The groaning came again, closer now. Then another sound, a huffing, snuffling sound that was definitely biological, definitely alive. Something was investigating the plane's exterior, moving around it with heavy, deliberate steps. Margaret heard the crunch of snow under enormous weight, heard what sounded like claws scraping against metal. The creature, the bear, It had to be the bear, was circling the wreckage, testing it, smelling it, knowing that something had changed, that its territory had been invaded. Margaret's mind raced through impossible calculations. The opening they'd come through was large enough for them to squeeze through one at a time, but it was also large enough for a grizzly to force its way in if it was determined enough. And a grizzly that size, that had claimed this territory as its own, would be determined. They had no weapons, no means of defense. If it decided to come in after them, they would die. She thought about Thomas, about how he died in the mine collapse. At least his death had been quick, merciful in its suddenness. This would be slow, terrifying. Listening to their doom approach, step by heavy step. The snuffling stopped directly outside their entry point. In the absolute silence that followed, Margaret could hear her own heartbeat, could hear 7 children holding their breath, could hear the tiny whisper of frost forming on the metal around them as their body heat met the frigid air. Then, unbelievably, the sounds began to recede. The heavy footsteps moved away, circling toward the rear of the plane, toward the tail section. The snuffling grew fainter. And finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, silence returned. Margaret didn't move, didn't let the children move. They stayed frozen in place for what might have been another hour, waiting to see if the creature would return. Only when she was reasonably certain it had moved away did she allow herself to breathe normally. "Is it gone?" Rose whispered. "I think so, for now. Will it come back?" Margaret thought about lying, about offering false comfort. But Rose was 14, old enough to deserve truth. "Probably. This is its territory. We're intruders. But it didn't try to get in tonight, and that means something. It means maybe it's more interested in keeping its territory than in attacking. We just need to be careful, be quiet, and try not to provoke it." "How long can we stay here?" That was the question, wasn't it? Howard had made it clear they couldn't go back. The settlement had no place for them. They had no money, no resources, no option. This plane, cursed, haunted, claimed by a monster, might be the only shelter they could find. "As long as we need to," Margaret said finally, "we'll make it work. Somehow." The night stretched on, endless and black. Margaret dozed in fits and starts, never quite falling into real sleep, always alert for the return of those heavy footsteps. The children, exhausted beyond endurance, slept more deeply, their small bodies huddled together for warmth under the blankets. When the first gray light of dawn finally began to seep through the cracks in the cockpit, Margaret felt a relief so profound it nearly brought tears. They had survived the first night. They were alive. She carefully extricated herself from the pile of children and moved to the entry point. Squeezing through the narrow gap, she emerged into the brutal beauty of an Alaskan dawn. The sky was streaked with pink and gold, the snow sparkled like diamonds, and the temperature had dropped even further overnight. Probably 40 below now, maybe more. And everywhere around the plane, clearly visible in the fresh snow, were the tracks. They circled the entire structure, massive paw prints with 4-inch claw marks extending beyond them. In the growing light, Margaret could see where the bear had reared up against the fuselage, leaving marks higher than she could reach. This wasn't just a large bear. This was a giant, something that should have been extinct, a throwback to a more primal age. But she also noticed something else. The tracks led away from the plane, down the mountain toward the tree line. The bear had left. It had investigated and then moved on, perhaps to hunt, perhaps to patrol the rest of its territory. They had a window, time to properly explore the plane, to see what they could salvage, to understand their new home. Margaret climbed back inside and woke Rose. "Help me wake the others, gently. We need to check everyone for frostbite." Together they examined each child in the growing light that filtered through from the cockpit. Jacob and Peter had some concerning white patches on their fingers and toes. Early stage frostbite. Anna and Mary seemed better, though both were dangerously thin. Lucy and Samuel were the most concerning, still lethargic, their lips tinged blue despite the night of forced movement. "We need fire," Rose said, stating the obvious. "We need food. We need water." "I know, and we need to find what we can in this plane before that bear comes back." The military cargo that had spilled across the bay proved to be a mixed blessing. Most of it was useless. Engine parts, metal tools, things designed for aircraft maintenance. But Margaret also found several canvas tarps that, while stiff with age and ice, could be thawed and used as additional insulation. She found metal containers that could serve as water collectors or cookpots. And most importantly, she found what looked like emergency supplies in a metal box welded to the fuselage wall. The box's latch had frozen solid, but using a piece of broken metal as a hammer and lever, Margaret managed to pry it open. Inside, protected from the elements by a rubber seal that had somehow remained intact, were items that felt like gifts from God himself. There were matches, not many, perhaps 20 in a waterproof container, but fire, the possibility of fire. There were emergency ration military surplus that had survived 15 years because they were designed to be nearly indestructible. Hardtack biscuits that looked and felt like rocks, canned meat that had probably been unappetizing when fresh and was definitely not improved by it, but food, actual food. There was a first aid kit with bandages, iodine, and most precious of all, a small bottle of aspirin. There was even a manual, waterlogged and frozen but still readable, titled Arctic Survival Guide. Margaret clutched these treasures to her chest and felt, for the first time since Howard had thrown them out, a fragile thread of hope. They could survive this. It wouldn't be easy, it wouldn't be comfortable, but they could survive. "Rose," she called, her voice cracking with emotion. "Rose, come come here." She showed her daughter what she'd found, saw the same hope kindle in Rose's tired eye. Together they made a plan. They would use some of the matches, precious, irreplaceable matches, to start a small fire. They would melt snow for water. They would ration the emergency food, mixing it with the little they'd brought, making it last as long as possible. They would survive the day, and then they would survive the next day and the day after that. For the first time since Thomas died, since Howard had closed the door in their faces, since they'd set out across the snow toward a cursed plain, Margaret allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they would make it through this. Outside in the distance, a deep roar echoed across the mountains. The bear, announcing its presence, claiming its territory, reminding them that this was borrowed shelter, borrowed time, borrowed life. But for now, in the growing light of a new day, Margaret had matches and food and her 7 children alive beside her. For now, that was enough. It took Margaret 3 precious matches to get it started, her hands shaking too badly from cold and hunger to strike properly the first 2 times. But the 3rd match caught on a small pile of shredded canvas and wood splinters she'd carved from a broken crate using a piece of sharp metal. The flame was tiny at first, barely more than a flicker, but she nursed it carefully, feeding it 1 splinter at a time until it grew strong enough to accept larger pieces. The children gathered around that small fire like worshippers at an altar, their faces reflecting the orange glow, their hands outstretched toward the first real warmth they'd felt in nearly 24 hours. Margaret melted snow in one of the metal containers, and when the water was finally lukewarm, she gave each child a few sips before allowing them to share one of the hardtack biscuits. The biscuit was impossibly hard, tasting like salted cardboard, but they sucked on it slowly, letting their saliva soften it enough to swallow. Combined with the warm water, it was the most satisfying meal Margaret could remember, not because it was good, but because it represented the survival. They had made it through the night. They had fire. They had food. They were alive. "Mom," Jacob said quietly, his voice still rough from the cold, "what are we going to do when the food runs out?" It was the question Margaret had been avoiding asking herself. She'd counted the emergency rations carefully. If they were extremely frugal, if they supplemented it with melted snow and rationed every bite, they might have food for a week, maybe 10 days if they really stretched it. But then what? "We'll figure it out," she said with more confidence than she felt. "The survival manual mentions ice fishing, setting snares for small game. Your father taught me some of those skills before the mine. We'll learn, we'll adapt." "What about the bear?" This from Peter, his 8-year-old eyes wide, fearful. "What if it comes back while we're outside?" Margaret had been thinking about that too. They couldn't stay trapped inside the plane forever. They needed to venture out for firewood, for snow to melt, eventually for food. But the bear, that massive territorial creature, was a constant threat. They needed to understand it, to predict its movement, to find a way to coexist with it. "We'll be smart about it," she said. "We'll watch for its tracks, learn its pattern. Animals are creatures of habit. If we can figure out when it hunts, when it sleeps, we can work around it." Rose, who'd been quiet while helping to care for Samuel, spoke up. "What if we can't work around it? What if it decides we're prey?" The unspoken answer hung in the cold air between them. If the bear decided they were prey, they would die. There was no fighting something that size, no outrunning it, no real defense. Their survival depended entirely on remaining beneath the bear's notice, being too insignificant to bother with, not worth the effort of hunting. "Then we make sure we're not worth hunting," Margaret said firmly. "We stay quiet. We don't leave food scraps outside. We make ourselves invisible." Over the next 3 days, they established a routine. Margaret would venture out first each morning, checking the area around the plane for fresh tracks, determining whether the bear had returned during the night or was still away. If the coast was clear, she would quickly gather snow in containers and collect any burnable wood from the sparse vegetation nearby, mostly dwarf willow and birch scrub that grew in the sheltered areas between rocks. The bear's pattern began to emerge. It left at dusk, heading down the mountain toward the tree line where the hunting was better. It would be gone most of the night and into the early morning, returning usually around mid-morning to sleep under the plane's fuselage where it had made its den. This gave Margaret a window of about 3 hours each dawn to work outside. She made the most of those hours. Using techniques from the survival manual and dim memories of things Thomas had taught her, she set simple snare traps near rabbit runs she'd spotted in the snow. She identified which plants were safe to eat, rose hips still clinging to frozen bushes, the inner bark of willow, even certain lichens growing on rocks. None of it was filling, but it supplemented their dwindling rations. On the 4th day, she checked her snares and found a snowshoe hare, frozen in death but fresh. She nearly cried with relief. Real meat, real protein for her children. She took the hare back to the plane, cleaned it quickly with hands that had become surprisingly steady at such tasks, and made a thin stew in the metal container. Stretching the meat with melted snow, tomato, and some wild onions she'd found growing in a sunny spot. The children ate slowly, reverently, making the small portions last. Even Samuel, who'd been worryingly lethargic, seemed to rally a bit after the hot food. But the real turning point came on the 5th day, when Margaret found the diary. She'd been exploring the cockpit area more thoroughly, looking for anything useful among the frozen remains of the pilot. She felt ghoulish doing it, rifling through dead men's possessions, but survival trumped propriety. The pilots had been military men. They would have understood. The logbook she'd seen that first night was still frozen to the dashboard, but beneath the co-pilot's seat, she found a leather journal that had been protected from the worst of the ice by the seat itself. Using body heat and patience, she managed to thaw it enough to open without destroying the page. The handwriting inside was cramped, desperate, written by someone who knew he was dying and wanted to leave some record, some testimony of his final days. His name had been Robert Hendricks, Captain, United States Army Air Corps. The date of the last entry was February 18th, 1939, 15 years and 1 month ago, almost to the day. Margaret read by the light filtering through the cockpit, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air, and learned the story of the ghost plane. Captain Hendricks and his co-pilot had been flying supplies from Anchorage to a remote outpost when they had hit unexpected weather, a blizzard that had come out of nowhere, as Alaskan weather often did. They tried to fly above it, but ice had formed on the wings faster than their de-icing equipment could handle. The plane had become too heavy, lost altitude, and crashed into the mountain. The co-pilot had died on impact. Hendricks had survived, but with both legs broken and ribs crushed. He knew he was dying, could feel the internal bleeding, the cold creeping into his extremities. The emergency radio was dead, destroyed in the crash. No one knew exactly where they'd gone down. Rescue, if it came at all, would be weeks away. He would be dead long before then. The early entries in the journal were clinical, matter of fact, Hendricks documenting his injuries, rationing his supplies, describing the wreckage, and his attempts to make himself comfortable as he waited for death. But then the tone changed. February 12th, day 5. I am not alone here. There is something in the mountains, something massive. I saw it today through the broken windscreen. A bear, but not like any bear I've encountered. It must weigh 2,000 pounds, perhaps more. Grizzly, but ancient, huge beyond reason. It approached the plane, investigated it, then made its den underneath the fuselage. I can hear it moving below me, can hear it breathing. I should be terrified, but I find I'm grateful for the company, even the company of a beast. At least I won't die completely alone. Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. The bear had been here from the beginning, had claimed this territory 15 years ago and never left. February 14th, the bear is still here. I've been watching it. It's territorial, protective of this area. Yesterday, I saw it drive off a pack of wolves that came too close. The ferocity was astonishing. But toward me, toward the plane, it shows no aggression. I think it recognizes that I'm no threat. I'm just another piece of wreckage, slowly dying in its domain. February 15th, I did something foolish today. Or perhaps it was wisdom born of delirium. I had 3 emergency rations left. I threw one out through the gap in the windscreen. I don't know what made me do it. Perhaps I wanted to see if the beast would accept an offering. Perhaps I just wanted to feel less alone in my dying. The bear took it, sniffed it cautiously, then ate it. I swear it looked at me afterward with what might have been not gratitude. Bears don't feel gratitude, but acknowledgement, recognition that I had shared my last resource with. February 16th, I fed the bear again today, my last ration. I'm going to die anyway. Might as well die having done one last decent thing. The bear sat outside the cockpit for an hour after, just sitting, watching me. I talked to it, told it about my life, my wife, my daughter. It just listened, or seemed to. I'm probably delirious with cold and pain, but I choose to believe I made a friend in my final hour. February 17th, I can barely move now. The cold has me. I can feel myself shutting down system by system. The bear is still here, still watching over the plane like some kind of sentinel. I find comfort in that. When I die, something will remember I was here. Even if it's just a dumb beast, something will know. The final entry was barely legible, written in a shaking hand. February 18th, to whoever finds this, if anyone ever does, know that I died at peace. The bear has been a better companion than I deserve. I've decided to leave it something in return. Behind the panel below the cockpit instrumentation, I've hidden the survival supplies that might have bought me another week of life. Emergency ration, medical supplies, fire starting equipment, a manual. I won't need them where I'm going, but someone else might. Someone else might crash here or get stranded or need shelter from the cold. If you're reading this, those supplies are for you. And if you see the bear, my friend, my guardian, treat it with respect. It's only protecting what's its. This is its home. You're just a visitor. Remember that. Tell my daughter Clara that her father died thinking of her. Tell my wife Ellen that I'm sorry I couldn't make it home. And treat the bear kindly. It's earned that much. The entry ended there. Captain Robert Hendricks had died that night or shortly after, alone except for a massive grizzly that had, for reasons only nature could explain, chosen to guard rather than devour. Margaret closed the journal carefully, tears freezing on her cheeks. She looked at the frozen remains still strapped in the pilot's seat. This man who'd shown kindness to a beast in his final hour, who'd left supplies for strangers he'd never meet, who died thinking of his family. Thank you, she whispered to the corpse, to the ghost, to whatever remained of Robert Hendricks in this metal tube. to him. Thank you for the supplies. Thank you for showing kindness. Thank you for teaching the bear that humans could be something other than threats. She understood now. The bear wasn't just territorial, it was loyal. Robert Hendricks had fed it, had treated it with respect in his dying days, and the bear, with whatever passed for memory and emotion in its massive brain, had stayed, had guarded this place for 15 years, had driven away wolves and other threats, had made this wreckage its sacred ground, the place where a dying human had shown it kindness. They weren't just intruders in the bear's territory, they were guests in a shrine. Margaret made her way back to the cargo bay where her children waited. They looked up at her expectantly, and she showed them the journal, read them the entries in a quiet voice. Even the youngest children understood the significance. They had stumbled into something bigger than themselves, a legacy of kindness that had outlasted death. We need to respect what Captain Hendricks started, Margaret said firmly. This bear isn't our enemy. It's the guardian of this place, just like the captain said. We're visitors in its home, and we need to act like it. How, Flynn? Rose asked practically. How do we show respect to something that could kill us with one swipe? Margaret thought about Robert Hendricks, dying and cold, sharing his last rations with a wild beast. Thought about the bear, which could have eaten a helpless human, but had chosen to guard instead. Thought about the balance of nature, the understanding that could exist between species if humans just tried. We share, she said simply, just like the captain did. When we catch a rabbit, we keep what we need and we leave the rest outside. We show the bear that we're not taking everything, that we know this is its home, that we're grateful for shelter. We make an offer. Mom, that's crazy, Jacob protested. That's our food. We're already starving, and we'll starve faster if the bear decides we're a threat, Margaret countered. But if we show respect, if we prove we understand the rules of this place, maybe, just maybe, it'll tolerate us, the same way it tolerated Captain Hendricks. It was a gamble, a huge, potentially fatal gamble. But sitting in that freezing plain, surrounded by her 7 children, reading the words of a dead man who'd found grace in his final moment, Margaret knew it was the right choice. That evening, when she checked her snares and found another hare, she did something that would have seemed fine in a week ago. She cleaned the animal, kept the meat for her children, and took the organs, heart, liver, kidneys, and placed them on a flat rock near the bear's den entrance. Then she backed away and returned to the plain. The next morning, the organs were gone, and in the snow beside the rock, clearly visible, was a single massive paw print. Not a threat, not a warning, but an acknowledgement. The bear had accepted the offer. Margaret stood looking at that print for a long moment, feeling something shift in her chest. They had reached an understanding, human and beast, mediated by the ghost of a kind man who died 15 years ago. They weren't safe. Not really. The cold could still kill them. Starvation was still a constant threat, and the bear could change its mind at any moment. But for now, in this moment, they had shelter, fire, and the tolerance of the mountain's most powerful resident. For now, they had hope. Captain Robert Hendricks, wherever his spirit had gone, had given them that. His last act of kindness, rippling forward through 15 years of ice and snow, had saved 8 more lives. Margaret whispered another prayer of thanks to a man she'd never met, then turned back to face another day of survival in the ghost plane. Behind her, somewhere in the rocks and ice, the guardian watched in silence. Winter in Alaska is not a season. It is a state of existence, a test that separates the living from the dead with cold indifference. Margaret had always known this intellectually, but living it, breathing it, fighting it every single day in a broken plane on a frozen mountain taught her the brutal reality behind the words. The first 2 weeks were the hardest, not because of any single catastrophic event, but because of the relentless, grinding accumulation of small miseries that threatened to break. The cold was omnipresent, seeping through metal and canvas and flesh, settling into bones with an ache that never fully disappeared. The hunger was worse, a constant gnawing presence that made Margaret's stomach cramp and her children's eyes go hollow and distant. But they adapted. Humans, especially desperate humans, have an incredible capacity for adaptation. Margaret's snare lines expanded from 3 traps to 12, positioned at strategic points around the mountain where she'd observed rabbit trails and ptarmigan scratching through snow for frozen berries. Her success rate was perhaps 1 catch for every 3 days of checking, but even that meager harvest made the difference between slow starvation and survival. She learned to waste nothing. Bones were boiled for broth, sinew was saved for cordage, fur was scraped and dried to line the children's inadequate boots. The bear, they'd taken to calling it Guardian after Captain Hendricks' journal, maintained its routine with clockwork precision. It left at dusk to hunt in the lower elevations, returning each dawn to sleep in its den beneath the fuselage. And each time Margaret made a kill, she left an off organs, bones with meat still clinging to them, whatever she could spare. The offerings always disappeared, and the bear never threatened them. It was an understanding, not a friendship. Margaret never made the mistake of anthropomorphizing the creature. Guardian was a wild animal, driven by instinct and territorial imperative. The tolerance it showed them was based on a simple equation. They posed no threat, they offered tribute, and they occupied only a small portion of its domain. As long as those factors remained true, the bear allowed them to live. But Margaret could feel her children changing. The softness was being burned away by cold and hunger and fear, replaced by something harder, more resilient. Rose, at 14, had stopped being a child and became Margaret's lieutenant, taking charge of the younger ones without being asked, rationing the fire's warmth, organizing their meager possessions with military efficiency. Jacob, only 10, had the watchful eyes of someone 3 times his age, alert to every sound, every change in wind, every potential threat. Even the youngest were different. Samuel, who'd been terrifyingly lethargic those first nights, had rallied with the regular food and warmth. He rarely cried now, having learned that tears accomplished nothing and wasted precious energy. Lucy, Anna, and Mary played quiet games in the cargo bay, their laughter subdued but present, proof that childhood could persist even in hell if given the smallest chance. Peter was the one who discovered the screaming wind's secret. It happened on the 16th day during one of the fierce storms that rolled through the mountains with terrifying regularity. The wind had been howling for hours, and with it came that eerie, almost human screaming from the cockpit air. The children were huddled near the fire, kept deliberately small to conserve their dwindling wood supply, when Peter suddenly stood up and walked toward the sound. "Peter, no," Margaret started, but he held up a hand. "Listen, Mom, really listen. It's not constant. It comes and goes with the wind gusts, and it's loudest when the wind comes from the north." Margaret listened. He was right. The screaming rose and fell in a pattern that matched the wind's intensity and direction. It wasn't random. It was mechanical. Together, she and Peter made their way to the cockpit, covering their faces against the frigid air that poured through the broken windscreen. In the dim light, Peter pointed to a specific crack in the metal, a jagged tear where the windscreen frame had buckled on impact. "There," he said, "the wind hits that edge, and the shape of the tear makes it vibrate at just the right frequency. It's like blowing across the top of a bottle. The metal is singing." Margaret stared at the crack, at this simple piece of physics that had spawned 15 years of ghost stories and kept people away from a perfectly serviceable shelter. She felt a laugh bubble up in her chest, slightly hysterical, but genuine. All those stories, all that fear, and it was just wind and metal and acoustics. "You're a smart boy," she told Peter, pulling him close. "Your father would be proud." But even as she said it, she felt a pang. Thomas should be here, should be seeing his children adapt and survive and grow strong in the crucible of hardship. Instead, he was buried under tons of rock. His body never recovered, his children orphaned and homeless. The unfairness of it threatened to overwhelm her, but Margaret pushed it down. There was no room for grief in survival. Grief was a luxury for people who had the energy to spare. The discovery of the screaming wind's source didn't make it less unsettling, but it did demystify it. The ghost plane was just a plane, broken and frozen and claimed by nature. The screams were just wind. The curse was just bad luck and harsh conditions. And the only real ghost here was Captain Hendricks, watching over them from whatever afterlife pilots who fed bears went to. On the 20th day, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. They couldn't survive on rabbits alone. The game was too scarce, too unpredictable. They needed a more reliable food source, and that meant taking a bigger risk. She'd seen signs of caribou in the lower elevations, tracks in the snow, browse marks on willow branches, droppings that were relatively fresh. Caribou meant meat, real substantial meat that could feed her family for weeks if properly preserved in the natural freezer of the Alaskan winter. But hunting caribou meant leaving the immediate area around and the plane. It meant venturing into territory that Guardian considered its prime hunting ground. It meant potential conflict. Margaret explained her plan to Rose, who listened with the serious expression she'd developed, the one that made her look 30 instead of 14. "If I don't come back," Margaret started, but Rose cut her off. "You'll come back. You have to. We need you. But if I don't, you know where the supplies are. You know how to maintain the fire. You know the offering routine with Guardian. You can keep them alive until spring, and then you can make your way down to the settlement." "Mom, stop!" Rose's voice was firm, adult, frightening in its certainty. "You're coming back. You're too stubborn to die out here. You've kept us alive this long, and you're not giving up now. So stop planning for failure and just go hunt that caribou." Margaret hugged her daughter, feeling the thinness of her, the way her rib pressed against her shirt, the way her spine was too prominent under Margaret's hand. They were all slowly starving, burning through their bodies' reserve, and Margaret knew that the emergency rations would run out in another week at most. This wasn't optional. This was necessary. She left before dawn, moving through the deep snow with a sharpened piece of metal strapped to a wooden shaft, a crude spear that would have to serve as her weapon. She'd fashioned it over several days, testing different configurations until she had something that was at least marginally functional. It wouldn't win any prizes for craftsmanship, but it could potentially pierce caribou hide if she got close enough and was lucky enough and desperate enough. The cold was profound, even for Alaska. 40 below at least, maybe cold. Her breath crystallized instantly, forming ice in her makeshift scarf. Her fingers went numb inside their inadequate gloves within minutes. But she pushed on, following the caribou signs downslope toward the tree line where the animals would be browsing. It took 3 hours of difficult travel before she spotted them. A small herd, perhaps 8 or 10 animals, pawing through snow to reach the lichens and dead grass beneath. They were wary, heads coming up frequently to scan for predators, but they hadn't detected her yet. She was downwind, and her movement was slow, cautious, learned from watching Guardian hunt. Margaret knew she had one chance. She was no hunter, no expert. She was a desperate mother with a crude spear and more courage than skill. She picked out her target, a young bull that had separated slightly from the herd, and and began her stalk. It took another hour to close the distance, moving between rocks and scrub, freezing motionless whenever the caribou looked in her direction. Her legs cramped, her fingers had gone completely numb, and her lungs burned with each breath of Arctic air. But she kept moving, kept closing, until she was perhaps 15 feet away, close enough that she could see the frost on the caribou's muzzle, close enough to act. She rose from behind her cover rock and threw the spear with every ounce of strength her weakened body could muster. The spear flew true enough. It caught the caribou in the shoulder, not a killing blow, but enough to wound, to slow. The animal bellowed in pain and surprise, and the herd scattered, crashing through snow in a thunder of hooves. But the wounded bull stumbled, fell, got up, tried to run again. Margaret ran after it, her own exhaustion forgotten in the primal rush of the hunt. She had wounded it, she had to finish it. Letting it escape to die slowly would be both cruel and wasteful. She caught up as it fell again, its blood steaming in the snow, its eyes rolling with fear and pain. She had no knife sharp enough to cut its throat humanely. All she had was a rock and the terrible necessity of survival. She did what had to be done, bringing the rock down again and again, until the animal stopped struggling, until its eyes went glassy and empty, until she was covered in blood and steam and the brutal reality of killing. Margaret collapsed beside the dead caribou, shaking not from cold but from reaction. She had killed. She had taken a life to sustain her children's lives. It was natural, necessary, the way of all carnivores since the beginning of time, but it still felt momentous, transformative, like she had crossed some invisible line that separated the civilized from the savage. But there was no time for philosophy. The smell of blood would attract predators, wolves, wolverines, possibly even Guardian itself. She needed to process the carcass and get it back to the plane before something else claimed it. The field dressing was crude but functional, learned from half-remembered instructions Thomas had once given her about hunting. She opened the body cavity, removed the organs, setting aside the heart and liver, both rich in nutrients, and began the impossible task of moving 200 pounds of meat and bone 3 miles uphill through deep snow. She couldn't carry it whole. Instead, she made multiple trips, cutting the caribou into manageable sections and dragging them uphill on a makeshift sled made from branches and canvas. Each trip took an hour, and she made 4 trips, working through the afternoon and into the evening, her body screaming with exhaustion, but her mind fixed on the single goal: get the meat home. It was nearly dark when she dragged the final load, the hindquarters, up to the plane. Rose saw her coming and rushed out with Jacob, both of them staring in disbelief at the amount of meat Margaret had brought. "Mom, you did it," Rose breathed. "You actually did it." Margaret couldn't speak. She just nodded, dropping the rope she'd been using to drag the sled, her hands bleeding and torn, her body beyond exhaustion. She'd done it. They had food, real food, enough to last them weeks if they were careful, if they kept it frozen, if they rationed properly. But even in her exhaustion, Margaret remembered her obligation. She took the caribou's heart, a significant offering, a prime piece of meat, and walked to the rock near Guardian's den. She placed it carefully, reverent, a tribute to the understanding they'd established. Then she returned to her children, to the warmth of their small fire, to the incredible luxury of knowing they would eat well tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. That night, they feasted. Margaret cooked caribou steaks over the fire, the smell of roasting meat filling the cargo bay for the first time since they'd arrived. The children ate slowly, their shrunken stomachs unable to handle large amounts, but the joy on their faces was worth more than gold. Samuel, who'd been so quiet for so long, looked up at Margaret with gravy on his chin and said, "Good, Mama, good." It was the first full sentence he'd spoken in weeks, and Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. They were going to make it. Against all odds, against nature and circumstance and cruel human indifference, they were going to survive. Later, after the children had fallen into full-bellied sleep, Margaret heard the heavy footsteps outside that signaled Guardian's return. She heard the snuffling investigation of the rock where she'd left the offering, heard the sound of the heart being consumed. And then, for the first time since they'd arrived, she heard something else, a deep rumbling sound that wasn't quite a growl, but wasn't quite anything else either. It took her a moment to identify it, and when she did, she wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry. The bear was purring, growling contentedly, making some sound of satisfaction that transcended species barriers. Margaret pressed her hand against the cold metal wall, separated from a 2,000-pound apex predator by a few inches of aluminum, and whispered, "You're welcome, Guard. Thank you for letting us stay." The sound continued for a moment longer, then faded as the bear settled into its den for the night. Inside the plane, 8 humans slept with full stomachs for the first time in a month. Outside, the wind screamed its mechanical song, and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient dance. And Alaska continued its patient work of killing or hardening everyone who dared to live within its borders. Margaret had proven herself hard enough to survive. Now she just had to stay that way until spring. The caribou meat changed their situation from desperate to merely difficult. Margaret carefully portioned the carcass, using the plane's natural refrigeration. The cargo bay stayed well below freezing to preserve what they couldn't immediately eat. She calculated that if they were extremely careful, if they supplemented with her snare catches in the dwindling emergency rations, they could stretch the meat for 3 weeks, maybe 4. But even as their immediate hunger crisis eased, Margaret knew they were were still in a precarious position. Winter in Alaska could last until May, sometimes June in the higher elevation. It was only early April now. They had at least 6 more weeks of serious cold, possibly 8 or 10 before the snow would melt enough to make travel down the mountain feasible for children. And there was another problem, one that kept Margaret awake during the long, dark hours when the wind screamed through the broken cockpit and her children slept their exhausted sleep around the dying embers of the fire. They were running out of things to burn. The sparse vegetation around the plane, the dwarf willows and scrub birch, had been nearly exhausted. She'd been burning broken pieces of wooden crates from the cargo hold, but those were running low too. Fire meant survival. Without it, they would freeze within days. She needed to find more fuel or find a way to make what they had last much, much longer. It was during one of her increasingly desperate searches through the plane's wreckage that she made the discovery that would alter their circumstances yet again. She'd been examining the cargo bay more systematically, looking for anything burnable, when she noticed something odd about one of the metal panels on the floor. Most of the panels were riveted or welded in place, but this one, located near the bulkhead that separated the cargo bay from the cockpit area, had screws instead. Old frozen screws, but screws nonetheless, which meant it was designed to be removed. Margaret fetched the basic toolkit she'd salvaged from the emergency supplies and spent half an hour working the screws loose. Her hands, already cracked and bleeding from the constant cold, screamed in protest, but she persisted. When the final screw came free, she lifted the panel and found herself staring into a hidden compartment about 3 feet deep and 2 feet square. It was a smuggler's cache, or perhaps just a storage space for things the crew wanted kept separate from official cargo, and it was full. Margaret's hands trembled as she pulled out the contents item by item, hardly believing what she was finding. There were more emergency rations, military surplus, similar to what she'd found before, but in much larger quantity. There were sealed containers of coffee, real coffee, something she hadn't tasted in months. There were cartons of cigarettes, useless to her, but potentially valuable for trade if they ever made it back to civilization. There were bottles of liquor, whiskey, vodka, rum, probably worth a small fortune on the black market in a territory that still had complicated liquor laws. But most importantly, there were medical supplies, real medical supplies, not just the basic first aid kit she'd found before. There were bottles of penicillin, precious antibiotics that could fight the infections that killed so many people in the wilderness. There were surgical tools, sterilized and sealed. There were pain medications, fever reducers, antiseptics, bandages, and most miraculous of all, there was a manual, Advanced Field Medicine for Military Personnel, that was essentially a condensed medical textbook. Margaret sat back on her heels, staring at this treasure trove, and felt tears streaming down her face. This was survival. This was more than survival. This was the margin between making it to spring and dying from some preventable infection or fever. This was insurance against a dozen different disasters that could still befall them. She pulled out item after item, cataloging everything, her mind already working through the implications. The food would extend their supplies significantly. The antibiotics meant that if one of the children got sick, not if, but when, because illness was inevitable in these conditions, she could actually treat them instead of just watching helplessly as fever took them. The pain medication meant she could ease suffering. The manual meant she could learn, could become more competent, could actually help instead of just hoping and praying. But there was something else in the cache, something that made Margaret's breath catch in her throat. At the very bottom, wrapped in oilcloth and carefully protected, was a stack of papers, official documents, military requisitions, shipping manifests, and a letter sealed in wax, addressed in careful handwriting, to be opened only by authorized Army personnel or next of kin. Margaret stared at the letter for a long moment. She was neither of those things. Opening it would be a violation of military protocol, possibly even illegal. But Captain Hendricks had been dead for 15 years, and whoever this letter was meant for had clearly never received it. She carefully broke the seal and unfolded the pages inside. It was Captain Hendricks' last will and testament, along with a longer letter explaining the situation. The will was straightforward. Everything he owned was left to his wife, Ellen, and daughter Clara, with specific instructions about how to access his military pension and life insurance. But it was the letter that held Margaret transfixed, reading by the dim light filtering through from the cockpit. To whoever finds this, if you're reading this, I am dead, and you have found my final resting place. I hope you are not in the same dire circumstances that brought me to this end. But if you are, if you have crashed or become stranded in this godforsaken place, then perhaps what I have to tell you will help you survive where I could not. First, the practical matters. This cache contains supplies I've gathered over my years of flying this route. Call it insurance, or perhaps just paranoia. I always knew these mountains could kill me, and I wanted to give any survivor, myself or others, the best chance possible. Everything here is yours. Take it, use it, survive with it. Second, the bear. By the time I'm writing this, I've spent several days in the company of what I believe is one of the largest grizzlies in Alaska. I have fed it, talked to it, and in some strange way made peace with it. I believe, and I recognize this may be the fever talking, that this bear will guard this place after after I'm gone. It has shown no aggression toward me, despite my complete vulnerability. I think it understands, in whatever way a bear's mind works, that this plane is something special. Respect it. Feed it if you can. Don't threaten it. And it may tolerate your presence the way it has tolerated mine. Third, and most important, there is another cache. This is not the only hiding place I've prepared. Margaret's heart rate accelerated. Another cache? Beyond the tree line, approximately 2 miles due east from this plane, there is a distinctive rock formation. 3 boulders stacked in a way that looks almost like a crude archway. I discovered it during one of my last surveys of this area before the crash. At the base of the southern boulder, buried 3 feet down and marked with a pile of smaller stones in a triangle pattern, I buried a metal box. Inside that box is everything I didn't want in official military hands. Cash, nearly $2,000, my life savings that I'd planned to surprise Ellen with when I got home. Gold coins, about 50 of them, that I'd been collecting, personal papers and photographs, and a complete set of topographical maps of this entire region, showing every valley, every passage, every potential route to civilization. I was going to recover this box on my next leave and bring it home. Obviously, that's not going to happen. So if you find this letter, that box, and everything in it is yours. Consider it payment for giving me a proper burial, if you're so inclined. Or consider it the spoils of survival. I don't care. I'll be beyond caring. But most of all, consider it hope. $2,000 and 50 gold coins can buy a lot of hope in Alaska. It can buy a new start, piece of land, a business, a future. Whatever you need, whatever you're running from or running toward, that money can help. The maps will show you the way down the mountain when spring comes. I've marked the safest routes in red ink, the dangerous ones in black. Follow the red, avoid the black, and you should make it to the settlement at Hollow Creek in about 4 days of hard travel with good weather. I've made my peace with death. I'm not afraid anymore. The cold is actually quite comfortable now, which I understand is a bad sign, but feels like a blessing. The bear is nearby, keeping watch. I couldn't ask for a better guardian in my final hour. To Ellen and Clara, I love you both more than I have words for. I'm sorry I won't be coming home. I'm sorry for all the missed birthdays and anniversaries and ordinary days that make up a life. But I'm not sorry for the life we had. It was a good life, and you made every day of it worth living. To whoever else reads this, survive. That's all that matters. Survive, get down the mountain, find my buried cache, and use it to build something good. Don't let this place beat you. Don't let the cold or the hunger or the fear win. Captain Robert Hendricks, United States Army Air Corps, signing off for the final time. The letter was dated February 17, 1939, the day before his final journal entry. He'd known he was dying, had accepted it with remarkable grace, and had spent his last coherent hours trying to help future survivors he would never meet. Margaret read the letter 3 times, memorizing the description of the rock formation, the location, the burial depth. $2,000, 50 gold coin. In 1954, that was an enormous sum of money. That was enough to buy a small house, to start a business, to give her children a real future instead of just day-to-day survival. But it was 2 miles away through deep snow, in terrain she didn't know, with only the vague description of 3 boulders like an archway to guide her, and it was buried 3 feet down in frozen ground that would be like digging through concrete. Still, the possibilities made her head spin. If she could find it, if she could recover it, when spring came, they wouldn't be going back to the settlement as beggars. They'd be going back with resources, with the means to start over, to build a real life. But that was a problem for later. Right now, she had immediate concern, keeping her children alive, maintaining their understanding with Guardian, making it through the rest of winter. She carefully refolded the letter and placed it with Captain Hendricks' journal, 2 pieces of a dead man's legacy that might yet save 8 living souls. Then she hauled the cache contents, the food, the medicine, the supplies, back to where Rose was watching the younger children. Rose's eyes went wide when she saw what Margaret had brought. "Mom, where did you find all this?" "Hidden compartment in the floor. Captain Hendricks left it for whoever might need it after him." Margaret began organizing the supplies, her mind already calculating how much this extended their survival window. "We have enough food now to make it to June easily. Maybe July if we're careful. And we have medicine, real medicine, if anyone gets sick." "That's amazing," I saw Rose breathe. "It's like he's still taking care of people, even after all these years." "That's exactly what it is," Margaret agreed. She decided not to mention the buried cache yet. That secret could wait. Right now, she needed to focus on the immediate benefits of what they'd found. Over the next few days, Margaret took stock of their improved situation. With the new food supplies, she could feed the children more substantial portions. She could see the difference almost immediately. Color returning to their cheeks, energy returning to their movement, even laughter becoming more frequent. Samuel, who'd been worryingly thin, began to fill out slightly. Lucy and Anna started playing more actively, their natural childhood exuberance returning as the worst of the hunger eased. But Margaret also noticed something else. The children were changing in ways that went beyond physical recovery. They were adapting not just to survive, but to thrive in this harsh environment. Jacob had become remarkably skilled at predicting weather change, reading the sky and wind the way some people read books. Peter had developed an almost preternatural ability to track small game. Rose had taken to the medical manual with the same intensity she'd once applied to schoolwork, learning anatomy and treatment protocols by the dim firelight. They were becoming something new, not civilized children playing at wilderness survival, but genuine children of the Alaskan wild, learning skills and developing instincts that would serve them for life. Margaret felt a strange mixture of pride and sadness watching this transformation. She'd wanted better for them, wanted school and friends and normal childhoods in warm houses with full pantries. Instead, they were learning to read animal tracks, to start fires in howling wind, to sleep light and wake ready for danger. But they were alive. And in this place, in this situation, that was its own kind of education. The relationship with Guardian continued to evolve in subtle ways. Margaret maintained her practice of leaving offerings after every successful hunt, and the bear continued to accept them with what seemed like genuine acknowledgement. She'd even begun to recognize the bear's patterns beyond just its daily routine, could tell by the sound of its breathing, whether it was in a deep sleep or merely resting, could interpret different vocalizations as contentment, irritation, or alert. It was Rose who first suggested they might actually be communicating with Bear. "Mom, watch," she said one morning when Guardian had returned from its nightly hunt. Rose picked up a piece of caribou bone with some meat still attached and walked slowly, carefully, hands visible, toward the den entrance. She stopped 10 feet away and placed the bone on the ground, then backed away. Guardian's massive head emerged from the den, eyes fixed on Rose. For a long moment, human and bear regarded each other. Then the bear huffed, not aggressively, but almost questioning. Rose slowly nodded as if answering, then turned and walked back to the plain entrance. The bear waited until she was inside, then emerged fully and took the bone, carrying it back to the den. "Did you see?" Rose asked excitedly. "It waited until I was safe before it moved. It knew I was giving it food, and it was, I don't know, respectful? Is that crazy?" "Maybe," Margaret admitted. "Or maybe Captain Hendricks was right, and this bear has learned that humans can be something other than threats. Maybe it remembers his kindness and extends that understanding to us." It was a romantic notion, probably anthropomorphizing the bear too much. But Margaret had seen enough in their weeks here to believe that Guardian was not just a mindless predator. There was intelligence there, memory, some capacity for learning and adaptation that went beyond simple instinct. They were coexisting, human family and apex predator, in a way that shouldn't have been possible, but somehow was. As April progressed, the weather began to show the first microscopic hints of spring. The deep cold eased slightly, only dropping to 20 below on the coldest nights instead of 40. The days grew marginally longer, though the sun was still weak and distant. And occasionally, very occasionally, Margaret could smell something in the air that wasn't pure ice and rock. It was the promise of thaw, still weeks away, but definitely coming. She began to think seriously about the buried cache. 2 miles wasn't that far, and with the children better fed and stronger, she could potentially leave them for a day while she searched. Rose was competent enough to manage the fire and watch the younger one. And if Margaret could find that money, those gold coins, those maps, the maps especially interested her. Captain Hendricks had marked safe routes down the mountain, routes that she could follow when the snow melted enough to travel. She wouldn't be stumbling blind through wilderness. She'd have about a dead pilot's expertise guiding her path. But the expedition would be risky. She'd be leaving her children alone in the plane for hours, maybe all day. Guardian had been tolerant so far, but that tolerance was based partly on Margaret's presence, her regular offering. What if something changed while she was gone? What if the bear decided that the children alone were prey rather than fellow inhabitants? Margaret wrestled with the decision for days, weighing risks against potential rewards. Finally, she decided they needed those maps. They needed whatever resources were in that cache. And Rose was strong enough, smart enough, responsible enough to keep everyone safe for one day. She explained her plan to Rose the night before she intended to leave. "I'll go at first light when Guardian leaves to hunt. I'll be back before dark, before it returns. You stay inside the plane no matter what. Keep the fire going, but small. We need to conserve wood. Don't go outside except to get snow for water, and only if you're absolutely sure Guardian isn't nearby." Rose nodded seriously. "I can do it, Mom. We'll be okay." "I know you can, baby. I know." That night, Margaret barely slept. She lay awake listening to the wind scream through the cockpit, listening to Guardian's deep breathing from the den below, listening to her children's soft sounds in sleep. She was about to leave them alone in a metal box on a frozen mountain, protected only by a crude understanding, with a massive predator and their own resource. If anything went wrong, she might come back to find them dead, or she might not come back at all, and they'd die slowly waiting for her return. But if she didn't take this chance, they'd be stuck here until the snow melted, and then they'd face the treacherous journey down the mountain with no maps, no money to start over with, nothing but the clothes on their backs, whatever they could carry. Sometimes survival demanded risks. Sometimes you had to gamble everything on one throw, because the alternative was slow death anyway. As the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the cockpit cracks, Margaret heard Guardian stir and then depart for its hunt. She gave it 20 minutes to get clear, then kissed each of her sleeping children, except Rose, who was already awake and watching her with those two old, too knowing eyes. "Be smart," Margaret whispered. "Be safe. I'll be back." "I know," Rose whispered back. "Go find Captain Hendricks' treasure." Margaret slipped out of the plane into the bitter pre-dawn cold and began walking east toward the tree line, toward 3 boulders that looked like an archway archway toward a dead man's hidden fortune and whatever fate awaited her in the frozen wilderness. Behind her in the ghost plane, 7 children waited for their mother to come home. The journey east toward the tree line was brutal in ways Margaret had fully anticipated. Without the children to slow her down, she could move faster, but she was also alone, completely, terrifyingly alone, in a landscape that had killed countless people far more experienced than her. Every depression in the snow could be hiding thin ice over a concealed stream. Every rock outcropping could be home to a wolverine or a smaller bear. Every step was a gamble. She'd left at dawn, and the weak sun was now climbing toward its brief zenith, casting long shadows across the endless white. Margaret had been walking for nearly 2 hours, stopping frequently to check her bearings against the landmarks Captain Hendricks had described. The tree line was visible now, a dark smudge of black spruce and birch against the snow, but finding 3 specific boulders in this vast wilderness felt like searching for a needle in a haystack made of needles. Her body protested every step. Despite the better food of recent weeks, she was still desperately thin, her muscles wasted from months of near starvation. The cold sapped her strength with every breath, and the altitude, they were well above 7,000 feet here, made her lungs burn. But she pushed on, driven by the tantalizing possibility of what lay buried beneath frozen ground. $2,000, 50 gold coins, maps that could guide them safely down the mountain. It was too much to hope for, too perfect to be real, but Captain Hendricks' letter had been specific, detailed, written by a man who knew he was dying and had no reason to lie. The wind picked up as she approached the tree line, carrying with it the scent of pinene and something else, something organic and wrong. Margaret's steps slowed, her senses suddenly alert danger. She recognized that smell, death, something dead and rotting, even in the cold. She crested a small rise and saw the source. A moose, or what remained of one, lay scattered across the snow. The carcass had been torn apart with massive force, bones cracked open for marrow, hide ripped away in great chunks. This was a fresh kill, maybe a day old at most, and the signature was unmistakable. Guardian had hunted here recently. Margaret's heart hammered as she scanned the area. Was the bear nearby? Had it seen her? She stood perfectly still for 5 full minutes, watching, listening, smelling the air for any sign of the massive predator, but there was nothing. Guardian had made its kill, fed, and moved on, leaving this gruesome tableau as evidence of its power. She gave the carcass a wide berth and continued into the tree line. The forest here was sparse, stunted trees fighting for survival at the edge of their range, but it provided some psychological comfort after weeks of living in endless white openness. Among the trees, she felt less exposed, less visible to whatever might be watching. It took another hour of searching, working in a grid pattern through the forest edge before she found them. 3 boulders, each the size of a small car, positioned in a way that did indeed look like a crude archway. They were partially covered in snow and ice, but the formation was unmistakable. Natural forces could have placed them this way, or perhaps ancient peoples had arranged them for some ceremonial purpose. Either way, they were exactly as Captain Hendricks had described. Margaret approached the southern boulder, her hands already reaching for the makeshift shovel she'd fashioned from a piece of metal and a wooden shaft. At the base of the boulder, partially hidden by drifted snow, was a pile of smaller stones arranged in a triangle pattern. The marker. She'd found it. Digging in frozen ground with inadequate tools was nightmarish work. The first foot was snow, relatively easy to clear. The next foot was ice-crusted dirt that fought every scrape of her shovel. And below that was permafrost, ground frozen solid since the last ice age, almost impervious to her efforts. But Margaret had not survived this long by giving up easily. She built a small fire, using precious matches but knowing she needed the heat to soften the frozen earth, and let it burn for 30 minutes, melting the surface ice. Then she dug some more, built another fire, dug again. It was slow, exhausting work that made her back scream and her hands bleed through her glove. 2 hours passed. 3. The sun had passed its zenith and was beginning its early descent toward the horizon. Margaret knew she should turn back, should return to her children before dark, but she was so close. The hole was nearly 3 feet deep now, and her shovel had hit something solid that wasn't rock or frozen earth. It was metal. With renewed energy born of desperation, Margaret cleared the remaining dirt and ice to expose a metal box about the size of a steamer trunk, sealed with a heavy padlock that had rusted but still held firm. She had no key, of course, but she had the strength of a mother who'd killed caribou with a crude spear and survived a month in a frozen plain. She wedged her shovel under the lock's hasp and levered with all her weight. The hasp held. She tried again, throwing her full body weight onto the shovel, using it as a lever against the frozen metal. Something in her shoulder tore with a white-hot flash of pain, but the hasp broke. The lock fell away and the box was open. Margaret lifted the lid with shaking hand and looked at Captain Hendricks' final gift to whoever survived after him. The money was there, exactly as he'd described. Stacks of bills wrapped in oilcloth, surprisingly well preserved despite 15 years in the ground. She didn't count it, didn't have time, but but even a quick glance suggested it was the full $2,000. The gold coins were in a leather pouch, heavy and solid, each one stamped with an eagle and a date. 50 pieces of hope, 50 chances at a new life. There were the maps too, rolled carefully and protected in a waterproof cylinder. Margaret pulled them out and unrolled them briefly, just enough to confirm they showed the region in detail, with routes marked in red and black ink exactly as the letter had described. Safe paths and dangerous ones, all laid out by a man who'd flown over this territory dozens of times and knew every valley and pass. But there was more in the box that the letter hadn't mentioned. A photograph of a woman and a young girl, both smiling, standing in front of a white house with roses climbing a trellis. Ellen and Clara Hendricks, frozen in a moment of happiness before tragedy took their husband and father. Margaret stared at their faces and felt the weight of 15 years of grief they'd carried, not knowing what had happened, where he'd died, whether he'd thought of them at the end. There was also a pocket watch, gold and heavy, engraved with initials, to RH from E8, all my love, always. A wedding ring, simple gold band. A letter to his daughter, sealed, that began, my dearest Clara, if you are reading this, I'm gone, but I want you to know. These were the intimate treasures of a life, things that had value beyond money because they were sacred to the people who loved the man who'd owned them. Margaret felt like a grave robber, an intruder in someone's most private moment. But Captain Hendricks had left all of this deliberately, had buried it not to hide it, but to preserve it, to ensure that if his body was never recovered, at least these pieces of him might find their way home, or might help someone else survive. He'd given up his chance to be buried with these treasures so that they could serve the living. Margaret carefully repacked everything into her canvas bag, working quickly now because the sun was getting dangerously low, and she had a 2-mile trek back to the plane through territory that would be hunting ground for Guardian and every other predator once darkness fell. She filled in the hole partially, no reason to leave evidence of her excavation, and scattered snow over the disturbed ground. Then she took a bearing on the plane's location using landmarks she'd memorized and began the journey back. The return trip was worse than the journey out. Her injured shoulder throbbed with every step, making it difficult to maintain her balance in the deep snow. The temperature was dropping fast as the sun descended, probably 30 below already and falling toward 40 or worse, and she was exhausted, pushed beyond the limits of what her starved, abused body should have been able to accomplish. But she had the treasure, had the means to build a new life, had the maps that would guide them to safety. She just had to make it back alive to use them. Darkness fell when she was still a mile from the plane. The stars came out in their billions, providing just enough light to navigate by, but also making every shadow deeper and more threatening. Margaret heard wolves howling somewhere to the north, their voices carrying across the frozen landscape in eerie harmonics. She heard other sounds too, rustlings and cracklings that could be wind or ice or something aloof and hungry moving through the night. She was perhaps a quarter-mile from the plane, moving as quickly as her exhausted body would allow, when she heard the sound that made her blood freeze more thoroughly than any temperature could. Heavy footsteps approaching from her left, moving fast. Guardian, the bear, must have caught her scent or heard her moving through the snow, or simply decided to investigate this disturbance in its territory. Margaret could hear it now, very close, the huffing breath and crunch of snow under massive paws. She had no weapon. She'd left her crude spear at the plane. She had nothing but the bag of treasure and her own worthless human body. If Guardian decided she was a threat or prey, she would die here, and her children would wait in the plane until cold or hunger or the bear itself killed them too. Margaret did the only thing she could think of. She stopped running and stood still, faced the direction the sound was coming from, made herself as tall as possible, and spoke, her voice surprisingly steady. Guardian, it's me, Margaret. I've been leaving you offerings. I'm not a threat. I'm just going home, to the plane, to my children. The bear emerged from the darkness like a mountain given light. Even knowing how large it was, seeing it up close in the starlight was terrifying beyond words. Guardian was massive, shaggy with winter fur, its eyes reflecting the starlight as it regarded the small human standing alone in the snow. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, predator and prey, master of the mountain and desperate interloper. The bear could kill her before she could even scream, could end her with one swipe of those enormous paws, but it didn't. Guardian huffed, a sound Margaret had learned to recognize as interrogative rather than aggressive. It took several steps closer, close enough that Margaret could smell it, that wild musk of fur and meat and ancient power, close enough that she could see the scars on its muzzle, the way its breath steamed in the freezing air. Then, incredibly, the bear turned away, took a few steps toward the plane, as if showing her the way, and looked back at her expectantly. Margaret almost laughed, the sound emerging as a half sob of relief and exhaustion. The bear was escorting her home, was making sure she got back to the plane safely. It was impossible, anthropomorphized, projecting human behavior onto an animal that couldn't possibly understand or care. But it was also happening. She followed Guardian through the snow, staying perhaps 20 feet behind, and the bear maintained that distance all the way back to the plane. When they arrived, Guardian went directly to its den, pausing only to look at Margaret one more time with those reflective eyes. "Thank you," Margaret whispered, knowing it was foolish but unable to stop herself. "Thank you, Guardian." The bear huffed once more and disappeared into its den. Margaret stumbled through the plane's entrance, where Rose was waiting, her face pale pale with worry. "Mom, you've been gone all day. We were so scared." "I'm fine, baby. I'm fine." Margaret dropped the bag on the floor and pulled her daughter into a fierce hug. "I found it. I found Captain Hendricks' cash. We have money now, Rose. Real money. And maps. Maps that will get us down the mountains safely when spring comes." Rose's eyes went wide as Margaret showed her the contents of the bag. The other children crowded around, even little Samuel, staring at the stacks of bills and the leather pouch of gold coins like they were looking at magic. "Is it real?" Jacob asked, touching one of the bills reverently. "It's real. $2,000 and 50 gold coins, plus these maps." Margaret unrolled the topographical maps, showing them the red lines that mark safe routes down the mountain. "Captain Hendricks marked the way. We won't be wandering blind. We'll know exactly where to go." "When can we leave?" Peter asked eagerly. Margaret looked at her children's hopeful faces and felt her heart clench. "Not yet, baby. We need to wait for the thaw. Another month, maybe 6 weeks. The snow has to melt enough for travel, and we need to get stronger before we can make that journey. But when we do go, we'll be going to a new life. Not back to the settlement as beggars, but as people with resources, with a future." That night, for the first time since they'd left the cabin, Margaret allowed herself to plan beyond simple survival. With $2,000, they could buy a small piece of land, could build a real house, not a shack, but an actual home, could afford to keep the children in school through the winter instead of pulling them out to work, could give them clothes that fit, food that filled their bellies, medical care when they needed it. It wouldn't be easy. Rebuilding a life never was, but it was possible now in a way it hadn't been before. She looked at Captain Hendricks' photograph, at Ellen and Clara smiling in the sunshine, and made a silent promise. When they got to civilization, she would find out what had happened to the Hendricks family, would make sure they knew where Robert had died, how he'd spent his final days, how his final act of generosity had saved 8 lives. She would return the personal items, the watch, the ring, the letter to Clara, to his family if they still lived, or to military authorities if they didn't. The money and the gold, though, those were survival. Those were her children's future. Captain Hendricks had left them deliberately for whoever survived after him, and Margaret would use them exactly as intended, to build a life from the ashes of loss. Outside, the wind screamed its mechanical song through the broken cockpit. Guardian breathed deeply in its den, sleeping off its latest hunt. And above it all, the stars wheeled in their ancient pattern, caring nothing for human struggles, but witnessing them nonetheless. Margaret slept that night with one hand on the bag of treasure and the other on her daughter, anchored between past generosity and future hope, surviving one more day in the ghost plane. Tomorrow they would continue the work of staying alive, but now they had something more than desperation to fuel. They had possibility. April gave way to May, and with it came the first real signs that winter's grip on the mountain was finally, grudgingly loosened. The change was subtle at first. A slight warming of the midday sun, a lengthening of daylight in hours, the occasional sound of dripping water as ice began its slow transformation back to liquid. But for Margaret and her children, who had survived 4 months in the ghost plane, these small changes represented everything. They represented hope, escape, and the possibility of returning to a world where survival didn't require constant vigilance against cold and hunger and death. The children had changed in ways that went far beyond the physical. Rose, at 14, had become Margaret's true partner in survival, capable of making life or death decisions with calm competence that would have been impossible before their ordeal. She could treat minor injuries using the medical manual, could ration supplies with mathematical precision, could read weather signs and animal behavior with an accuracy that bordered on preternatural. Jacob, now 11, had developed into the family's hunter and trapper. His snare lines had expanded to cover nearly a square mile around the plain, and his success rate had improved to the point where they caught something, rabbit, ptarmigan, occasionally even a fox, almost every other day. He moved through the snow with efficiency born of necessity, his thin body hardened by months of labor that would have broken most adults. Peter, at 9, had become their engineer and problem solver. He'd figured out how to improve their fire's efficiency by creating a crude reflector from salvaged aluminum that directed heat back toward the living area. He'd devised a better water collection system that melted snow using residual heat from the fire. He'd even managed to repair some of the plane's torn metal panels, creating better wind protection around their living space. The younger children, Anna, Mary, Lucy, and Samuel, had grown in subtler but equally important ways. They'd learned patience, silence when necessary, the ability to endure discomfort without complaint. Samuel, who'd been barely 2 when they arrived and had nearly died from hypothermia that first terrible night, was now a sturdy 3-year-old who could identify animal tracks in the snow and knew instinctively to freeze and be quiet when Guardian was nearby. They had become something unique, a family forged not by the comfortable bonds of civilization, but by the brutal necessity of surviving together in one of Earth's harshest environments. They were closer than most families could ever be because they had literally kept each other alive day after day, week after week, month after month. And through it all, Guardian had been their silent partner. The massive grizzly had maintained its routine with remarkable consistency, hunting nightly in the lower elevations and returning each dawn to sleep in its den beneath the plane. Margaret had continued her practice of leaving offerings after every successful hunt, and the bear had continued to accept them with what she'd come to recognize as acknowledgement, if not quite gratitude. But as the thaw progressed, Margaret noticed changes in Guardian's behavior too. The bear was eating less of the offerings, sometimes ignoring them entirely. It was spending more time away from the den, sometimes not returning for 2 or 3 days at a stretch. And when it did return, it seemed restless, pacing the perimeter of the plain rather than settling immediately to sleep. It was Rose who realized what was happening. "Mom," she said one morning, as they watched Guardian emerge from the den and immediately begin moving down the mountain, "I think Guardian is preparing to leave. The bears, they have territories, right? And this has been Guardian's winter territory. But now that spring is coming, it probably needs to move to wherever it spends the summer." Margaret felt an unexpected pang at the thought. Guardian had been terrifying at first, a constant threat that could have killed them all with minimal effort. But over the months, the bear had become part of their lives, a presence as constant as the wind or the cold. The thought of it leaving, of the plain being truly empty after they departed, felt somehow wrong. "We should leave it something special," Margaret decided. "One final offer to thank it for tolerating us all winter, for letting us live in its territory." When Jacob caught a particularly large snowshoe hare 2 days later, Margaret made her decision. Instead of keeping any of it for her family, they had sufficient food from their remaining supplies and the caribou meat she'd carefully preserved. She cleaned the entire animal and left it on the offering rock, whole and fresh. That evening, as the sun set in spectacular colors that only the Arctic sky could produce, Guardian emerged from its den one final time. The bear approached the rock, sniffed the offering, then looked directly at the plain's entrance where Margaret stood watching. For a long moment, they regarded each other. Woman and bear, human and wild creature, two survivors who had shared space and season in this harsh place. Then Guardian picked up the hare gently in its massive jaws, huffed once, a sound Margaret had learned meant acknowledgement, acceptance, and began walking down the mountain. Margaret watched until the bear disappeared into the tree line, becoming just another shadow among shadows. She knew with absolute certainty that she would never see Guardian again. The bear would move to its summer territory, wherever that was, and by the time it returned to this mountain next winter, her family would be long gone. "Goodbye, Guardian," she whispered into the wind. "Thank you for the gift of time. Thank you for teaching us that even the most fearsome things can show mercy. Thank you for honoring Captain Hendricks' kindness by extending it to us." The wind carried her words away into the vast emptiness of the Alaskan wilderness, where they joined countless other prayers and thanks and desperate words that humans had spoken into the indifferent face of nature since the beginning of time. With Guardian gone, the plain felt simultaneously safer and more vulnerable. Safer because the massive predator was no longer a constant presence, no longer a threat if something went wrong or if the understanding between them broke down, but more vulnerable because Guardian had been more than just a tolerated threat. It had been an apex predator whose very presence kept other dangers at bay. The wolves that had once howled in the distance but never approached, the wolverines that had given the area a wide berth. Even smaller predators like foxes and lynx had been scarce because Guardian's scent marked this as claimed territory. Now that scent would fade and the plain would become just another potential den, another resource to be claimed by whatever creature was bold enough to investigate. "We need to leave soon," Margaret told Rose as they studied Captain Hendricks' maps by firelight. The snow is melting fast now. In another 2 weeks, maybe 3, the passes he marked should be clear enough for travel. Rose traced the red line that marked their intended route down the eastern slope of the mountain, following a series of valleys and ridges that would take them around the worst of the remaining snow, eventually connecting to an old trapping trail that led to Hollow Creek, the nearest settlement of any size. 4 days of travel, Rose read from the notes Captain Hendricks had made on the map margin. "Assuming good weather and no injury. With 7 children, we should probably plan for 6 or 7 days." Margaret nodded. 7 days of hiking through wilderness with children ranging from 3 to 14 years old. 7 days of exposure to weather, wildlife, in a dozen different ways to die. But staying in the plain past the thaw was equally dangerous. Once summer truly arrived, this place would become a different kind of hell, plagued by insects, with food sources that would require ranging farther and farther from their shelter, with the very real possibility of being trapped here for another entire winter. No, they had to go. The risk of the journey was real, but the risk of staying was certain. They spent the next 2 weeks preparing with the same meticulous care that had kept them alive all winter. Margaret divided the money from Captain Hendricks' cash into multiple hiding places, some sewn into the lining of their coat, some distributed among the children's packs, so that if they were robbed or lost some of their supplies, they wouldn't lose everything. The gold coins she put in a leather pouch that she wore around her neck, hidden under her clothes. The maps she protected in a waterproof wrap and kept in her own pack, along with the medical supplies, emergency rations, and fire-starting equipment. They made practice hikes, short journeys of a mile or 2 down the mountain and back, building the children's endurance and identifying potential problems before they committed to the full journey. Samuel struggled with the distance at first, but Rose fashioned a crude carrier that allowed Margaret or Jacob to carry him on their backs when necessary. They cached supplies at strategic points along their intended route, small stacks stashes of food and fire-making materials buried under distinctive rock piles. Insurance against disaster during the main journey. If something went wrong, if they had to abandon their packs or lost their supplies in a stream crossing, these caches might mean the difference between survival and death. And finally, they said goodbye to the ghost plane. Margaret stood in the cargo bay on their final morning, looking at the space that had been their home for 4 months. The crude sleeping area they'd built from canvas and salvaged cargo. The fire pit with its aluminum reflector. The corner where she'd hidden the emergency supplies, now empty. The entrance she'd squeezed through carrying Samuel that first terrible night, certain they were all going to die. "Thank you," she said quietly to the empty plane, to Captain Hendricks' ghost, to whatever spirit of survival had sustained them through the darkest time. "Thank you for shelter when we had none. Thank you for holding back the cold just enough. Thank you for being our metal womb, keeping us alive until we could be born into whatever comes next." She left one final offering, not for Guardian, who was gone, but for the mountain itself. She took one of the precious gold coins and placed it on the cockpit dashboard, next to where Captain Hendricks' frozen remains still sat in the pilot's seat. "This is for you, Captain," she said, touching the frozen shoulder of his flight suit gently. "A debt paid for the supplies that saved us, for the maps that are guiding us home, for the example of kindness you showed to a wild creature that had every reason to kill you, but chose to guard you instead. We're taking your personal effects to your family, if we can find them. We'll make sure Ellen and Clara know how you died, and how you saved 8 people you never met. Your legacy didn't die with you, Captain. It lived in us, and it will live in my children and in their children. Thank you." Outside, her 7 children waited with their packs, ready for the journey. Margaret took one last look around the plane, memorizing details she knew she'd need to remember, to tell someday when her children asked about the winter they survived in the ghost plane. Then she stepped out into the bright May morning and began walking down the mountain. The journey was every bit as difficult as Margaret had feared, but also more manageable than her worst imagined. Captain Hendricks' maps were extraordinarily detailed, showing not just routes but also noting hazards, water sources, sheltered camping spots, and landmarks that made navigation straightforward. It was like having a guardian angel whispering directions in her ear. The first day took them 6 miles down the eastern slope, following a ridgeline that was already mostly clear of snow. They camped that night in a natural shelter formed by an overhang of rock, and Margaret allowed a fire for warmth and cooking, something she'd been paranoid about during the winter, fearing that smoke might attract unwanted attention, but now understanding that fire was simply another tool of survival. The second day was harder. They had to cross a series of streams swollen with snowmelt, wading through water so cold it felt like knives cutting into their legs. Peter slipped and went completely under, and Margaret's heart stopped until Jacob pulled him out, sputtering but alive. They stopped to dry him by a fire, losing 2 hours but potentially saving his life. Wet clothes in this climate could still kill, even though the worst of winter was past. The third day brought rain, cold and miserable, that soaked them all despite their best efforts. They made only 4 miles, and Margaret seriously considered stopping, turning back, finding shelter to wait out the weather. But turning back meant 7 more miles to the plane. And what would they do then? Wait for next spring? They pushed on, following the map's guidance to a cave that offered shelter, where they huddled together for warmth while the rain poured down outside. The 4th day was better. The sun emerged, and while everything was wet and muddy, at least they weren't being actively rained on. They made good progress, covering nearly 8 miles, and Margaret recognized landmarks from the map that told her they were more than halfway to Hollow Creek. The 5th day brought their first real encounter with other humans. They'd been walking for perhaps 3 hours when they heard voices ahead, men's voice, rough and loud. Margaret immediately ordered the children to stay hidden while she investigated. She found 3 trappers making a camp near a stream, their winter's take of furs piled high, clearly heading to Hollow Creek to sell and resupply. They were rough-looking men, bearded and dirty, but their eyes widened when they saw Margaret emerge from the brush. "Lady, what in God's name are you doing out here?" the oldest one asked. "Are you lost? Did your party get separated?" Margaret made a quick decision about how much to tell them. "We spent the winter in a plane wreck up the mountain, an old military crash. We're heading to Hollow Creek now that the thaw is clear." The men exchanged glances, clearly skeptical. "You spent all winter in the old ghost plane? With kids? Lady, nobody goes up there. That's bear territory. There's a monster grizzly that—" "I know about the bear," Margaret interrupted. "We managed to avoid it, mostly stayed inside, kept quiet, but we need to get to civilization now. Are we on the right trail to Hollow Creek?" The trappers confirmed they were and offered to share their camp that night. Margaret accepted cautiously, keeping her children close and her valuable cargo hidden. The men were curious about their survival story, but respectful enough not to pry when Margaret made it clear she didn't want to elaborate. In the morning, the trappers gave them a gift, a package of dried meat and some cornmeal, supplies they could easily spare from their own abundant stores. "For the kids," the oldest one said. "You must be a hell of a woman to keep them alive all winter in that place. Good luck in Hollow Creek." It was the first kindness from strangers in so long that Margaret almost cried. She thanked them profusely and led her children back onto the trail. The 6th day was their last full day of travel. They were in lower elevation now, and the snow was completely gone, replaced by the first green shoots of alpine flowers and the running streams of meltwater. The children's spirits lifted as the landscape became less harsh, more welcome. And on the morning of the seventh day, they crested a final ridge and saw Hollow Creek spread out in the valley below, a small settlement of perhaps 50 buildings, smoke rising from chimneys, the first signs of true civilization they'd seen in 4 months. Margaret stood on that ridge with her 7 children gathered around her, looking down at their destination, and felt emotions she couldn't name. Relief, certainly, exhaustion, pride in what they'd accomplished, but also a strange melancholy, a recognition that something profound had ended and they would never be quite the same people they'd been before. "Are we really done?" Samuel asked, holding her hand and looking up at her with those serious eyes he'd developed. "We're really done, baby," Margaret confirmed. "We made it. We survived." "Will we ever see Guardian again?" Lucy asked. Margaret thought about the massive bear, about the understanding they'd forged, about Captain Hendricks' legacy of kindness rippling forward through 15 years. "No, sweetheart. Guardian lives on the mountain, and that's where Guardian will stay. But we'll remember. We'll always remember." They walked down into Hollow Creek that afternoon, 7 children and 1 widow, carrying everything they owned in packs on their backs and a fortune in gold and cash hidden in their clothes. They must have looked like refugees from some disaster. And in a way they were, because people stopped to stare as they made their way to the general store that also served as the town's informal information center. The storekeeper, a woman named Martha Henderson, who'd seen 3 decades of Alaskan hardship and wasn't easily surprised, took one look at Margaret and her children and immediately began organizing help. Within an hour, they had temporary lodging in a church hall, hot food, clean clothes, and a doctor examining the children for injuries or illness. The doctor found them remarkably healthy given their ordeal. Thin, yes, and showing signs of long-term nutritional stress, but no major injury, no frostbite beyond some scarring on Jacob's finger, no infection that the antibiotics they'd used hadn't already handled. "Madam," the doctor said wonderingly, "I don't know how you did it, but you kept 7 children alive through an Alaskan winter in the most primitive conditions imaginable. That's extraordinary." Margaret didn't tell him about the emergency supplies, the caribou hunt, the offerings to Guardian, the buried treasure. She just smiled tiredly and said, "We did what we had to do. We survived." Over the next several days, they recovered and adjusted to being around other people again. Margaret began the work of building their new life. She exchanged some of the gold coins for cash at the town's small bank, claiming they were family heirlooms she'd been carrying. She used part of the money to buy proper supplies, real clothes that fit, sturdy boots, camping equipment in case they ever needed it again. But she also began making inquiries about land, about property that might be for sale, about opportunities for a woman with resources, but no husband and 7 children to feed. She found it 3 weeks later, a small homestead about 10 miles from Hollow Creek, abandoned by a family that had given up and moved south. It had a cabin that needed work, 20 acres of barely cleared land, and access to a stream for water. It cost $400, a fortune for most people, pocket change for Margaret now. She bought it outright, paying in cash, and moved her children to their new home in early June. And for the first time since Thomas died, since Howard threw them out, since that terrible night when they'd stumbled into the ghost plane expecting to die, Margaret allowed herself to believe they might actually have a future. The first year was hard. They had to rebuild the cabin, clear more land, plant crops late in the season, and hope for the best. But they'd survive 4 months in a frozen plain. Farming in Alaska's summer was paradise by comparison. Rose enrolled in the local school when it opened in September, soaking up education like a sponge. Jacob became known as the best young hunter in the area. Peter's mechanical aptitude led to him apprenticing with the town's mechanic. The younger children thrived in the structure and safety of their new life. And Margaret, slowly but surely, built a reputation as a woman you didn't cross but could count on in a crisis. She used some of her remaining money to help other families in trouble, remembering what it felt like to be desperate with nowhere to turn. She never forgot the lessons of survival the mountain had taught. 2 years after they left the ghost plane, Margaret made a special trip to Anchorage. She'd finally tracked down information about Captain Robert Hendricks' family. Ellen Hendricks had died in 1947, but Clara, now Clara Hendricks Morris, was still alive, working as a teacher and raising 3 children of her own. Margaret showed up at Clara's door with a package containing her father's pocket watch, his wedding ring, and the sealed letter he'd written to his daughter in his final hours. She told Clara the whole story, how she'd found the plane, how Captain Hendricks' supplies had saved them, how his maps had guided them home, how his kindness to Guardian had created an understanding that protected them through the winter. Clara wept as she read her father's final letter, learning for the first time exactly how he died, what his final thoughts had been, how he'd spent his last days showing kindness to a wild creature. "Thank you," she told Margaret through her tears. "Thank you for bringing him home, even if it's just these pieces. Thank you for honoring what he did. Thank you for surviving because of him. He saved our lives," Margaret said simply. "All 8 of us. The least I could do was make sure you knew the kind of man he was at the end." The years passed. Margaret's children grew up strong and capable, marked forever by their winter in the ghost plane, but not broken by it. They told the story to their own children eventually, endlessly, and those children told their children until it became a family legend. The winter Grandma Margaret kept everyone alive in a frozen plain, sharing space with a giant bear, learning that survival sometimes means understanding the things you fear. Margaret herself lived to be 83, never remarrying, never leaving Alaska. She died peacefully in her sleep in 1987, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, all of them descendants of that desperate night when she'd chosen the ghost plane over certain death in a blizzard. At her funeral, Rose, now an elderly woman herself, told the complete story for the last time about Thomas dying in the mine, about Howard throwing them out, about the decision to seek shelter in the cursed plane, about Guardian, about Captain Hendricks' legacy, about the buried treasure and the hard journey home. My mother taught us that survival isn't just about staying alive, Rose said to the assembled crowd. It's about staying human while you do it. It's about showing kindness even when you're desperate. It's about understanding that sometimes the things that terrify you most can become your salvation if you approach them with respect rather than fear. She learned that from a dead pilot in a giant bear, and she spent the rest of her life teaching it to us. The ghost plane still sits on that mountain, slowly being reclaimed by nature. Guardian has long since died, probably in the 1960s or 70s given the lifespan of grizzly bears. But hikers who venture up there sometimes report feeling watched, protected, as if something still guards that sacred ground where a pilot showed kindness and a widow learned to survive. And on clear nights, when the wind is right, you can still hear the screaming, that eerie mechanical song of wind through torn metal, singing its endless elegy for all the souls who found shelter in the ghost plane and lived to tell about. Margaret's legacy wasn't the money or the land or even the children she raised. It was the lessons she learned in that frozen plane and spent the rest of her life teaching. In the coldest, darkest, most desperate time, kindness matters. Understanding matters. Respect for the wild things that share our world matters. And sometimes when you face your greatest fear with courage and grace, it transforms from a monster into a guardian. That was the gift Captain Robert Hendricks gave to Margaret's family. And that was the gift Margaret gave to everyone whose life she touched afterward. The screaming wind still sings on the mountain. But for those who know the story, it's not a sound of horror anymore. It's a lullaby, a reminder, a promise that even in the coldest places, even in the darkest time, survival is possible if you face it with courage, kindness, and respect for the things that came before you. Margaret survived the ghost plane, and in surviving, she taught 8 people and eventually dozens more how to truly live.